All right. Just want to make sure everyone's here. Good. There you are. Perfect. Just in time. All right then, let's get started. Welcome back to another one of Mr. Lang's vlogs. Today we're taking a look at the Second Industrial Revolution. Now this is part of a bigger unit, the transformation of American society. So this is going to be part one of this video. Alrighty, let's get started. So first we're going to be talking about the corporations, these robber barons as they're sometimes called, these huge rich tycoons, and how they almost monopolized America, and in some cases they did. First, we've got to talk about the expansion of industry during this era. Now this era is going to be primarily after the Civil War, going all the way through into the early 1900s. What we're going to see is after the Civil War, the U.S. was still largely agricultural, but that's going to change. By 1920, we're going to have the U.S. being one of the leading industrial powers in the world. The enormous growth really was down to three factors. We're going to talk about them all a little bit more in depth throughout this. First is natural resources. We're going to have so many more natural resources that are at disposal, especially a big one, as you can see here, oil. The second one is, of course, governmental support. We're going to see there's going to be reforms that go on throughout this whole era as well, and these reforms are going to be huge in helping the workers and helping industry expand. And third is urbanization. People are going to be moving to the cities. That's where all the jobs are, and we're going to see that especially during this era. So one of the biggest things we see during this era is the Bessemer process. What this was a new way to go ahead and, well, make steel. Now, oil wasn't the only natural resource that was very coveted, very valuable. Coal and iron were very plentiful as well in the US and were big businesses, but really steel is going to change the United States and the world. Now, steel was not a new invention. In fact, the samurai used it in their katanas. Used it to make their katanas during a time in ancient Japan, but it was very hard to make. Now the Bessemer process is going to go ahead and simplify that. It's going to make it much easier, much quicker, much faster, and it's going to make one man by the name of Andrew Carnegie millions upon millions of dollars. So what it does, the Bessemer process, is you remove the impurities from iron, and when you do, you add carbon, you infuse it. And thus you get this lighter, more flexible, stronger compound called steel. Now, although we are going to see Andrew Carnegie is going to be incredibly rich off this process and his steel-making plant in Pittsburgh, the Bessemer process was not invented by him. In fact, it's something that was he took from England, as it was Henry Bessemer and William Kelly who went ahead and created this process. In fact, they were using it to make bullets, and that's where he went ahead and said, I could use this. And of course, as a Scottish immigrant here to the US, he makes millions off of it. So a little bit more about Andrew Carnegie. Again, bringing that process over from England is what's going to make him a huge millionaire. He's going to enter the steel industry in 1873, and by 1899, Carnegie Steel was one of the most largest industries we had here in the US, right along with Standard Oil and Rockefeller, which we're going to talk about. Again, we're talking about, honestly, more steel came out of Carnegie Steel here in the US than all of Great Britain combined. That's how big Carnegie was, and again, how rich he was as well. So all this steel now, everyone's buying it up. What are they using it for? Well, believe it or not, railroads are still growing, especially after the Civil War, and they're going to use steel to lay down those tracks. They were literally the biggest customers. You're going to have skyscrapers, as we're going to have cities not only build outward with railroads, but build up as well. Again, you couldn't build buildings with iron, as it wasn't strong enough. Here we also see probably the most famous, the last track laid on the Transcontinental Railroad, literally combining the East Coast to the West Coast, which is pretty impressive. So again, these cities are growing, they're growing up, they're growing out, and it's all because of steel. Now you can see why Carnegie made millions off of this and became one of those robber barons, as we call them. Now, this whole second industrial revolution really shows what capitalism is. Now, you've probably heard of capitalism, as this is what we have here in our country. Again, a version of it. There's never been a pure capitalist society. But what it really is, to give you the definition for it, the official one, is that it's an economic system which private business runs most industries, and it's competition that determines how much goods are and how much workers are paid. So to kind of boil that down and give you a more simplified version, capitalism is an economy where businesses are owned by individual people, and how much a product is determined literally by its supply and demand, and of course how much workers and all that are paid. And that's where it comes into a capitalist society that's a little different from something we're going to be getting into soon called communism, because capitalism really has to do with how much workers are going to get paid. In a communist society, everyone is paid equally. We're going to get more into that later. Also, something that comes out of this is free enterprise. That's the belief that the economy would prosper if businesses were left to their own devices, meaning literally they had no government regulation whatsoever, and they could compete in a free market. That can get dangerous, as of course it skirts the line of what we call social Darwinism, which is literally, just as you probably learned with Charles Darwin, it's basically, the strong survive, the weak perish. The same goes here for businesses. Again, if you're not a good business person, or you're not a good, if you're not selling a good business, this isn't your thing, then yeah, you perish. But the strong survive. The problem is that creates a lot of monopolies. And of course makes these gigantic corporations that aren't going to go ahead and really care about their workers or pay them fairly. And that's where we go into next, because what we see here for one of the first times in US history is corporations start to bloom. Now, a corporation is essentially a company that sells stock to investors to raise money. So what that means is a corporation is a company that's large enough to go ahead and you can literally buy a share of it. You could be a shareholder. To give you an idea, right now, if you want to go ahead and, go play the stock market, again, you'd have to be 18, you could go ahead and buy a part of Disney. Yes, you could buy part of Disney. You would be a shareholder. You'd buy a share or maybe a few shares. Now, realistically, you own probably a pebble that someone's kicking around Disney World right now, but you do technically own part of that company. Again, 0.000000001%, but you do own part of that. You're a shareholder because Disney is a corporation. Now, if a company is not publicly traded, then it isn't necessarily a corporation, at least for the confines of what we've been learning about. There are some different scenarios and cases, but we won't get too deep into the weeds, as they say with that. Now, Andrew Carnegie is a huge proponent of, yes, we need to invest in this stock market, and in fact encourages people to invest in stocks to go ahead and grow the market. In this, we start to see something called mass marketing. Mass marketing is something that you are hit with every day. Again, whether it's a YouTube video, whether it's any type of ad that you see on your phone, or the million ads you click out of because they're all coming up. Again, before you see something or an ad in the middle of a show, we have so many ads. That's mass marketing. That's where you have these brand names, these logos, these phrases, these jingles, all these, even packaging that plays an important role in promoting goods. Think about it. When you get a package at your door and it has a big smile on it, it's of course from what company? Exactly. It's from Amazon, which is a corporation, by the way. So again, you see that. You see a half-eaten apple. Well, quarter-eaten apple. It's Apple. You see anything like ba-da-ba-ba-ba, right? You just thought of that, the rest of it in your head. That's what mass marketing does, and it's ingenious. It makes it so when you see something right away, you know what it is. Like the swoosh on the Nike symbol, that you know right away is Nike. So the techniques they used to use back then are billboards, magazines, newspapers, and so on. Again, eventually, when we get into the 1920s, that even changes to radio, and of course, when we get through to the 1950s, that changes to television. But not quite yet, not during the Second Industrial Revolution. And today, ads are everywhere. They're in YouTube videos, Hulu, you know, in some cases they make you pay to get rid of the ads, because of course, there's just so many now. Gosh. So, one of the things we see is, of course, monopolies start to form. And that's with business growth and consolidation. Mergers could lead to a trust or a monopoly. Now, there are minute differences between monopolies and trusts, but for our purposes, we're just going to kind of group them together. But essentially, a monopoly, or a trust in our case, is complete control over an industry. This is where you have only one company or one corporation that's going to go ahead and control the entire industry. Think of it this way. If Verizon bought out all the cell phone providers, got T-Mobile, AT&T, all them, and they were the only ones that you could get your cell phone plan through, that would be a monopoly, because they have no competition. And monopolies can hurt the consumers. They can hurt us, because at the end of the day, they can go ahead and do whatever they want to those prices. It doesn't matter, because if they're the only cell phone company, if you need a cell phone, you have to go through them. Now, back in the Second Industrial Revolution, we had something very similar that happened. It was with Rockefeller and Standard Oil. So we're going to get into John D. Rockefeller in a moment, but his company was, of course, an oil company, Standard Oil, that owned 2% of the country's crude oil in 1870. By 1880, he controlled over 90%. That's in 10 years. Controlled over 90% of the U.S.'s oil. That's huge. And here he is. John D. Rockefeller is, at this point, the richest person in modern history that has lived in the United States. Again, John D. Rockefeller tried to turn the oil industry into this one single enormous business run by him. Man, was he close. You could even say he did do it. He founded Standard Oil, like I said, in 1870, and became filthy rich. He is going to be a philanthropist, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. But a philanthropist is someone who gives back to, gives back to the community through charitable events. He's going to donate approximately $500 million to charities and other good causes. Again, back then, and that type of money there. Because again, that was over half his fortune. He was worth $900 million back then. In today's money, that's $340 billion that he was worth at the height of his career in 1913. $340 billion in today's money. That's crazy. So when we go ahead and we say, oh yeah, they gave back $500 million. It's like a drop in the bucket to the $900 million that he owned. Even if you divide the $34 billion, divide that in half, still doing pretty good. If you did $1 billion, you'd be doing pretty good. Again, it's crazy but true. And despite these guys being labeled as greedy barons and rich industrialists, they had a generous side. Granted, again, it's a drop in the bucket for them. Again, when we see very rich people give away money for charities and such, that's called philanthropy. And Carnegie is going to do the same thing. And Vanderbilt's going to do the same thing, who we're going to talk about on the next slide. Carnegie built libraries. Rockefeller had Leland Stanford was one of those there. Rockefeller Chapel. There's so many things that they donated to. Cornelius Vanderbilt's going to build schools like Vanderbilt. And of course, that's our next guy. Cornelius Vanderbilt. This guy got his wealth by buying up all the railroads. He bought a ton of little railroads, combined them, and literally made a monopoly out of the railroads here. So if you had to go ahead and you had to ship something between cities, money was going right to him. And he did make them more efficient. However, he was becoming, very, very unequal in his rates. If you were a smaller company, you'd pay more. If you was his good buddy Rockefeller, you'd pay less. You'd get discounts. So it is interesting to see just even how they were working with one another, because they all were in the same boat. They were these gigantic big tycoons. Another one is J.P. Morgan. We're not going to get too much into him in this chapter, but again, he's going to be another one of these big tycoons. Now, how are we going to go ahead and stop these guys from making these huge monopolies? Well, they put through the Sherman Antitrust Act. Again, in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was supposed to go ahead and make it illegal to form a monopoly, or like we said, a trust. And these prosecuting companies under the act was not easy, because these companies would do some pretty shady stuff. They would simply reorganize into single little companies, saying, hey, we're not monopolies, see, I have a competitor. 7 out of 8 cases were thrown out of the Supreme Court. They were just hard to get them. We are going to see later on, Teddy Roosevelt's going to go ahead and take a better stance at this, but it was hard to nab these guys, it really was. Now this is what I consider real trust, okay? Speaking of trust, this is real trust right here, okay? Moving on. One of the interesting industries here we see is Pullman. So George Pullman in 1880 actually builds a factory and a town. Yes. Again, he builds a factory for manufacturing what we call sleeper cars. These are these really nice railroad cars that, you know, you could go ahead and they call sleeper cars because you could sleep in them. Nearby, he built a town for his employees. And it was actually modeled after early industrial European towns and such. He was very strict in what he went ahead and his rules and curfews and everything else. So he lowered their wages in around 1894, and he didn't lower the price of the rent in his town. So it's gonna lead to a very violent strike. Again, not a good look, not a good idea either. Okay. Now here we are talking about all these industries, but how about the workers? Well, the workers actually suffered a lot. Routinely they would work 6 or 7 days a week. They had no vacations, no sick time, no workman's comp. There was no OSHA, which I know you take the OSHA safety course and you're probably like, no OSHA. OSHA's good. OSHA's very good. It protects your safety. Even if it's a very long course you have to take. I know, I had to do 20 hours. And again, we had so many injuries and fatalities. Again, but in 1882 alone, the statistic was 675 workers were killed per week on average on the job. And again, no families didn't get compensation, for that. These are loved ones that are dying, and of course, it's just because of the safety. There's no safety. So Mother Jones, or Mary Harris Jones, but she's more commonly known as Mother Jones, is probably the most feared woman in America at this point because she was a labor activist. She scared the big tycoons because she was for the average workers. She fought to go ahead and make sure they had, lower work weeks where you're not working 6 or 7 days a week. You're not working, 80 plus hours a week. She's one of those that are fighting for reforms here in the U.S. for the workers. She's the voice. It's pretty amazing. All right, during this time we also have inventions. Oh, there's so many inventions during this time. Again, here's the 4 we're going to be talking about. I'm sure you can identify at least some of them, because during this time we see some of the biggest inventions that still are around today. They just look maybe a little bit different or have been vastly improved. So the first one we're going to talk about is harnessing electricity. Something we take for granted. You're literally watching this video right now and it's using electricity. I'm using a lot of electricity actually to go ahead and film this, and you're using electricity to watch it. Whether it's DC with the battery on the phone or a laptop, or AC because it's plugged into the wall using AC to charge that DC battery. Again, you're using electricity non-stop, especially because the lights alone, right? So Thomas Alva Edison goes ahead and establishes the first research lab in New Jersey, and because of that, he kind of gets to be known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. It's really this whole research lab that was meant to just go ahead and make new inventions. Now, he was not the only one in that lab. Again, we always credit Edison. However, realistically, a lot of these weren't Edison. It was Edison's team. It was his men that were under him there. And so he's going to perfect the incandescent light bulb. And that's huge. It really is. Again, his team, I should say, is going to perfect the light bulb. So the incandescent light bulb was around beforehand, but he's going to find a way to go ahead and make it last longer. He had tried a bunch of different filaments. That's that little piece that's in there, kind of looks like a little spring. And if you look at like older incandescent bulbs, obviously nowadays we have LEDs, so it's a little bit different. But again, even if you think about that, this invention has now been since improved. Later, he's going to invent an entire distribution of electricity, producing and distributing electricity throughout the United States. And very famously, there's the current wars between the two, between Edison and Nikola Tesla. Another one is the ching, 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 bing, the typewriter. Man, we see the typewriter everywhere. Christopher Sholes invented the typewriter in 1867, and his invention forever changed office work and paperwork as a whole. It opened a new avenue for jobs for women, which again, we know women can do way more than just this, but obviously back then it was a foot in the door, and that's huge. By 1870, women made up about 5% of the workforce, and by 1910, they're going to make up to 40% of the workforce. And a lot of that's because of those, secretarial jobs, thanks to the typewriter. And we're going to have a telephone. Oh my goodness, telephones are everywhere. But this is the original one by Alexander Graham Bell. This invention is very important, as this now goes ahead and makes communication even faster, even more instant. Again, him and his assistant Watson unveiled their invention in 1876, in which his first words were, "Watson, come here. Watson, are you there?" Because it was an open line, and so again, there was no ringing or anything like that. This is going to improve communication over telegraph and the mail and everything else. This is going to be a big deal, and phones are soon going to literally be installed throughout the entire nation. And now, look at them, they're all wireless. It's all wireless now. We also have the first modern automobile during this time. 1886, Carl Benz goes ahead and invents the first gas-powered automobile with a combustible engine. Later, he's going to go ahead and make the car brand, Mercedes-Benz. It's interesting because this, what he called the horseless carriage, actually kind of freaked people out at first. But nevertheless, obviously it is the first modern automobile we see. Although he wasn't in the U.S., we are going to see the U.S. is going to take this and go and make some of the best cars soon, as you'll see. All right, and that's what we got for you for today. Thanks for joining me, and we'll catch you back in the class.